My wife raised her glass at the baby shower, looked directly at me across the room, and said 5 words that stopped 65 conversations mid-sentence. Garrett isn't the father. I didn't flinch. I didn't shout. I walked outside, pulled out my phone, and made the call I'd hoped I'd never have to make. Her father saw me leave. He went white. He crossed the room in 4 steps, grabbed her arm, and whispered something that drains the color from her face in under 3 seconds. Triumphant to terrified in 3 seconds flat. She thought she'd just won. She didn't know that her father had handed me something 2 years ago, something buried on page 52 of a document she'd never bothered to read. What happened next would cost her the baby shower, the marriage, and an inheritance she assumed was untouchable. My name is Garrett Hollis. I'm 43 years old. I own a commercial HVAC and refrigeration repair company, the kind of business that keeps restaurants running, warehouses cold, and medical facilities operational. I built it from a single service van and a rented storage unit. 12 years later, it employs 9 technicians and services 3 counties. I have a daughter named Iris. She's 7. Gap-toothed, obsessed with raccoons for reasons she can't fully explain, and she's the single best thing I've ever been part of. Until that Saturday afternoon in April, I believed I had a second child on the way. The baby shower was Simone's production from the beginning. 65 guests, a vineyard venue outside Temecula, string lights, pastel tablecloths, a catered spread that rivaled most wedding receptions. Her father, Victor Chambers, sat at the head table like he always did, spine straight, whiskey in hand, watching the room with those flat investor's eyes that never stopped calculating. Iris had been bouncing since morning. She'd tugged my sleeve before we left the house and asked, "Dad, do you think it's a boy or a girl?" I told her I didn't know. She said she didn't care, as long as the baby liked raccoons. I laughed. That laugh feels like it belonged to a different man now. The room was loud and full when Simone took the microphone. I was near the back, talking to a supplier I hadn't seen in months when the noise faded. Simone had that look, the one she wore when she'd already decided something and wanted an audience for it. She raised her glass, smiled at the room, then locked her eyes directly on me. "I think it's time everyone knew the truth." Her voice was bright, clear, completely calm. Garrett isn't the father. The room didn't gasp, it just stopped. Forks froze, conversations cut off mid-word. 64 people turned to look at me. I stood there holding a glass of sparkling water, completely still. I didn't shout, I didn't move toward her. I set the glass down on the nearest table, buttoned my jacket, and walked outside. The parking lot was warm and quiet. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to one contact, and pressed call. 2 rings. "It's time," I said. "Initiate everything we discussed." Through the glass doors behind me, I watched Victor Chambers rise from his chair. He crossed the room in a straight line, jaw tight, and grabbed Simone by the arm. He leaned close to her ear. Even from outside, I could see what his words did to her face. A friend who was standing close enough told me later exactly what he said. "Do you have any idea what you just did? Start begging him to come back inside right now, or you're going to lose absolutely everything." She didn't move fast enough. Neither did he. I was already on my way to my attorney's office.
People always assumed Victor Chambers married his daughter off to me because I was useful. They weren't entirely wrong, but the full story is more complicated than that. And if you want to understand why one phone call in a parking lot could unravel a decades-old family empire, you need to understand how it was built and who Victor trusted to hold it together. I met Simone at an industry trade show in Las Vegas 11 years ago. She was walking the floor with her father, learning the business, or pretending to. I was there trying to land maintenance contracts with restaurant chains for my refrigeration units. Victor cornered me at my booth, looked at my service specs for about 45 seconds, then said, "You actually know what you're doing." Coming from him, that was practically a marriage proposal. Simone and I got serious within the year. Victor warmed up slowly, the way cold compressors do, reluctantly and only under pressure. But by the time we married, something had shifted. He'd watched me handle a contract dispute without flinching, watched me turn a failing equipment deal into a profitable service agreement. And somewhere along the way, he stopped testing me and started talking to me like a partner. Iris came along 3 years into the marriage. Victor held her in the hospital room with the stiff carefulness of a man who'd never quite learned tenderness. I saw something move behind his eyes that I hadn't seen before. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. 2 years after that, Victor called me into his home office, a room that smelled like old leather and bourbon and decisions, and laid it all out. His sons, Simone's 2 brothers, had proven themselves spectacularly unreliable. Preston had burned through a development fund chasing a vacation rental in Arizona that never broke ground. Miles had spent the better part of a year consulting for a startup that turned out to be a vanity project for a college friend. Victor was 69 by then. He was done pretending his bloodline would protect his legacy. "I need someone who reads a balance sheet the way a mechanic reads a diagnostic code," he told me, pouring 2 glasses without asking. "That's you, not my boys." What he handed me wasn't just a title, it was operational control of the Chambers family trust, real estate holdings across 2 states, a commercial property portfolio, a private foundation, and a set of governing documents thick enough to stop a door. Buried inside those documents, on a page most people would never reach, was a clause his attorney had drafted years earlier after a quiet family scandal involving Preston and a business partner's wife. A morality clause, the kind that gave the acting trustee, me, full authority to freeze distributions and assets if any named beneficiary engaged in conduct deemed publicly damaging to the family's reputation. Victor never mentioned it directly. I found it myself during my first full read-through. I flagged it in the margin, filed it away, and didn't think about it for years, until I needed it. The week before the baby shower, something shifted. Simone was distracted in a way that had edges to it, not the soft distraction of pregnancy fatigue, something sharper, like she was rehearsing something in her head. She snapped at Iris twice over nothing. She took a call in the backyard and stayed out there 20 minutes past dark. I didn't confront her, I just watched. And I made a quiet call to my attorney, a man named Douglas Whitmore who'd handled my business contracts for 6 years. "If something happens," I told him, "I want to be ready to move within the hour." He didn't ask what kind of something. He just said, "I'll have everything staged." Iris asked me that Friday night if the new baby could share her raccoon books. I told her absolutely. She went to bed satisfied. I went to bed knowing the following afternoon was going to change everything. I just didn't know yet how far the damage would reach.
Douglas Whitmore's office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. I'd been sitting across from his desk for about 20 minutes when my phone started going off. Simone, 4 times in a row. Then Victor, then Simone again. I turned the phone face down and kept talking. Douglas was the kind of attorney who never looked surprised. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen he kept clicking without seeming to notice. I laid out everything. The clause, the documentation I'd already pulled together over the previous 3 weeks, the nature of the public incident. He listened without interrupting, made 6 lines of notes, then said, "You understand this is going to move fast once we file." I told him that was exactly what I wanted. By the time I got home that evening, Simone's car was in the driveway and every light in the house was on. Iris was at my mother's. I'd arranged that the morning of the shower, just in case. I walked in through the garage, set my keys on the counter, poured a glass of water. Simone came down the stairs like she was expecting a fight. She'd changed out of the shower dress into jeans and a sweater,
which somehow made the whole thing feel more deliberate. "You need to stop whatever you started," she said. "Call Douglas and tell him to stand down." I drank some water. "No." "Garrett." Her voice had that edge she used when she thought volume alone could move me. "This is insane. You're going to blow up our entire family over one moment." "You blew it up," I said. "I'm just filing the paperwork." She crossed her arms. "My father will reverse it. He'll call the board and have your access revoked before the week is out." I set the glass down and looked her directly. "Simone, your father made me executive trustee with full irrevocable authority. His words, his attorney, his signature. He can call whoever he wants. The clause is already triggered. The freeze is already in motion. And there's nothing in that document that allows him to override my decision unilaterally." I paused. "You might want to read page 52 of the charter before you make any more promises about what he can fix." Have you ever watched someone realize in real time that they underestimated you completely? The certainty in her face flickered, just for a second. "This is more than today," I continued. "You've been pulling away for 8 months. You stopped talking to me like a partner. You started managing me like a problem. And now you stood up in front of 64 people and told them the baby isn't mine." I stepped closer. "That isn't a moment. That's a conclusion." "You're being dramatic," she said, but her voice had less steel in it now. "I'm being accurate. There's a difference." She tried 3 more angles over the next 40 minutes. She said I was punishing Iris. I told her Iris was protected. Her trust allocation was structured separately, and I hadn't touched it. She said I was humiliating her. I said she handled that herself. She said her father would tell the board I acted in bad faith. I told him to have him try, and reminded her that the compliance committee included 2 of Victor's most conservative cousins, neither of whom had forgotten the Arizona disaster. That one landed. She sat down on the couch and went quiet. When she spoke again, the anger was gone. Something smaller had replaced it. "What do you want from me, Garrett, right now?" I picked up my keys. "Nothing. I'm going to get Iris from my mother's. She wants to come home, and this house still belongs to her, regardless of what happens between us." I drove to my mother's house in Riverside. Iris ran to the door in her socks and threw her arms around my waist without asking a single question about where I'd been. I held on to that for a long moment. Some things don't need documents. They just need to still be standing.
The DNA kit sat in my desk drawer for 11 days before I used it. I'd ordered it the morning after the shower, while my head was still spinning from what Douglas and I had discussed the evening before. It wasn't impulsive. It was the question I'd been refusing to ask out loud for months. And once Simone had answered the public version of it in front of 64 witnesses, I figured I owed myself the private version too. Iris didn't know anything was happening. She went to school, came home, ate cereal for breakfast, and argued about bedtime. She built increasingly elaborate raccoon habitats out of cardboard boxes in the hallway, tunnels, dens, feeding stations, all labeled with crooked handwriting and decorated with markers. I watched her and tried not to do the math on her features, tried not to notice the way she squinted when she concentrated, the same way I do. Tried not to notice the shape of her chin, the set of her shoulders, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking hard about something. Tried not to notice, and noticed anyway. I swabbed the kit late one evening while she was asleep. Just a gentle swipe inside her cheek. She stirred, but didn't wake. I stood in her doorway for a long time afterward, watching her breathe. Sent it off the next morning on my way to the shop. Then I went back to work. 3 commercial AC units in for repair, a walk-in freezer compressor that needed a full rebuild, a medical storage unit with a faulty thermostat that a clinic was desperate to get back online. I kept my hands busy while my head ran laps. Every night that week, Iris asked me questions I couldn't answer. "Dad, why isn't Mom eating dinner with us?" Dad, is the baby still coming? Dad, are you sad? I told her things were complicated right now. I told her the baby was still coming, but things were changing. I told her I wasn't sad, just tired. That last one was a lie. On day 8, she climbed onto the couch next to me while I was pretending to read and said, "You're doing that thing again." "What thing?" "Where you look at me like you're trying to remember something." 7 years old, too observant for her own good. I put the book down. "I'm just thinking about how much I love you, that's all." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she said, "Okay, can we watch the raccoon documentary again?" We watched it. She fell asleep against my shoulder halfway through, and I carried her to bed, and I stood in her doorway again, and I waited. 3 more days. The results came on a Thursday. I was at my workbench when the email notification hit my phone. I'd been rebuilding a condenser motor, the kind of focused work that usually empties my head, but that notification sound cut through everything. I set down the socket wrench, wiped my hands on a shop rag, opened it.
The email was clinical, sterile, a PDF attachment with a laboratory header and a case number. I scrolled past the methodology section, past the sample verification, past the technical language designed for courtrooms and custody battles, and then I found the number. Iris Marie Hollis. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down on the workbench and sat very still for about 2 minutes. She was mine. Completely, mathematically, unambiguously mine. I don't know exactly what I'd been bracing for. I told myself I was prepared for either result. But sitting there in my shop, with grease on my forearms and that number glowing on my screen, something I hadn't realized I was holding released all at once. I had to put both hands flat on the workbench to keep from doing something embarrassing. She was mine. Sometimes the truth arrives quietly in an email, and you realize that staying aware, staying ready to face what's real, is the only thing that kept you from falling apart. Whatever Simone had done, whoever she'd been with, however long the lies had been running, Iris was still my daughter. The baby Simone was carrying might belong to someone else, but the girl who loved raccoons and asked impossible questions and fell asleep on my shoulder during documentaries, she was mine. She had always been mine. That evening, I picked Iris up from school and took her to get tacos. Her choice, always the same place, always a chicken quesadilla with extra cheese. We sat in a booth by the window, and she talked about a project her class was doing on animal adaptations. She explained in detail why raccoons were the most adaptable mammals in North America. I listened to every word. At one point, she looked up from her food and said, "Dad, are you and Mom going to stop living together?" Kids don't ease into things. I've always admired that about them. "Things are going to change," I told her honestly, "but I'm not going anywhere, not from you. That part stays the same, no matter what." She thought about this for a moment, chewing, processing. Then she said, "Okay, can I get churros?" I told her she could get 2 if she wanted. She settled for 1 and went back to explaining raccoon behavior. If you've ever held your breath waiting for an answer that could change your entire life, you understand exactly what that moment felt like. And you understand why a 7-year-old asking for churros felt like the most important thing in the world. That night, after she was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a copy of the trust documents and Douglas's latest update. The freeze was holding. Victor had contacted the compliance board twice and been referred to the charter both times. Simone's informal legal inquiry had gone nowhere. The machinery was turning exactly as designed. But none of that was what I was thinking about. I was thinking about a 7-year-old girl asking a fair question over a chicken quesadilla, getting a straight answer, and deciding churros were the right response. That kid had her priorities in order. I was going to make sure I kept mine the same way.
Douglas didn't recommend hiring a private investigator. He said it wasn't legally necessary. The public incident alone was sufficient to sustain the clause. But he also said, and I remember his exact words, "If you want to know the full shape of what you're dealing with, that's a different kind of preparation." He slid a business card across the desk without making it a suggestion, just information. I called the number that evening. The investigator's name was Howard Nash, mid-50s, former insurance fraud examiner, no social media presence, which I took as a good sign. We met at a diner near my shop the following week. He drank black coffee, asked 8 direct questions, and quoted a flat rate. I hired him on the spot. He came back to me in 9 days. I was at the shop when he called, halfway through rewiring a commercial dishwasher control panel. I told my technician to finish the job and took the call in my office, a small room off the main floor with a window that looked out over the equipment yard. Howard's report was precise. The man's name was Reed Ashburn, 41 years old. He worked as a general contractor specializing in commercial renovations, restaurants, retail spaces, medical offices, the same industry circles I operated in, which explained how paths had crossed. He and Simone had apparently met at an industry networking event 14 months ago. Howard had photographs, time-stamped from 3 separate locations: a restaurant in Glendale, a hotel parking structure in Burbank, a coffee shop 2 blocks from Iris's stool. That last one sat in my chest like a hot coal. 2 blocks from my daughter's school, while I was at work, while Iris was learning to read and doing art projects and trusting that her world was stable. There was more. Reed Ashburn had no idea Simone was pregnant. Howard confirmed this through a source inside Reed's company, an office manager who'd overheard a phone conversation in which Reed expressed, with considerable agitation, that he'd just learned about the baby shower announcement through mutual industry contact. He had no prior knowledge of the pregnancy. She manipulated him, too. He thought he was building something real. What does that tell you about who she really was the whole time? So she'd been using him without telling him, and she'd been using me as the financial floor she planned to land on. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up. The following afternoon, Simone's brothers showed up at my shop unannounced. Both of them, Preston and Miles Chambers, mid-40s, tans they maintained year-round, attitudes calibrated for men with more leverage than they actually had. Preston did most of the talking. He stood in my equipment yard in a sport coat and told me I was making a mistake, that the family would come together to resolve this privately, that I should stand down and let Victor handle it. I listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "Are you done?" Preston blinked. "Garrett, I have 2 cameras covering this yard, one at the gate, one on the south wall, both recording with audio. Whatever you came here to say is now on file, so if either of you plans to follow this conversation with anything that looks like intimidation or interference, Douglas Whitmore will have the footage before you're back on the freeway." Miles, who hadn't said much, looked at the camera above the south door. He touched Preston's arm. They left. I forwarded the footage to Douglas that evening. He filed it with the compliance record the next morning. The walls were closing in on Simone. She just didn't know how tight they were going to get.
Victor called me 2 days after his sons left my equipment yard. He'd been calling Douglas, who kept redirecting him to the charter. Apparently, he'd finally decided to try me directly. The conversation was short. He opened with disappointment, moved quickly to pressure, arrived at a thinly veiled suggestion that I was damaging the family's legacy for personal reasons. "Victor," I said, "you gave me the authority to protect this trust from exactly this kind of reputational event. You wrote the clause. Your attorney drafted it. Your signature is on every page. If you'd like to argue that I'm misusing my authority, you're welcome to take that position to the compliance board. I'll see you there." He went quiet. Then, in a lower voice, he said, "She's my daughter." "I know," I said, "and Iris is mine. I have the paperwork to prove it." He didn't respond to that,
The call ended shortly after. But that wasn't the end of Victor's problems. It was just the beginning. Douglas called me the following Thursday morning with the kind of voice that means he's found something significant and is choosing his words carefully. "There's something in the trust review you need to see in person," he said. "Come in this afternoon." I rearranged 2 client appointments and was at his office by 2 o'clock. He had a printed summary on the desk and a spreadsheet open on his monitor. The trust compliance review, triggered by the clause activation, had involved a full audit of all accounts under the charter, standard procedure. What wasn't standard was what the auditor had surfaced in the offshore account structure. Over a period of approximately 5 years, a series of transfers had moved funds from one of the trust's foundation accounts into a private account in Victor's name alone. The transfers were small individually, easy to miss if you weren't looking, but there were 38 of them. The total was substantial enough to constitute a serious breach of fiduciary responsibility. I sat in the chair across from Douglas and looked at the spreadsheet for a long time without speaking. "Is this what I think it is?" I asked. "That's for a forensic accountant to determine," Douglas said carefully. "What I can tell you is that these transfers were not authorized under the charter governing documents, and as acting executive, you are required to flag and report them to the compliance board." I leaned back. The man who told everyone else to follow the rules had been breaking them for years, and now I was the one required to report him. Victor had built a trust. He'd made himself the patriarch, the architect, the moral authority. He'd lectured his sons on fiscal responsibility while quietly moving funds out of a foundation account and into his personal holdings. He'd handed me the keys to the vault, never imagining I'd look in the corners. "File it," I said. Douglas paused. "Garrett, you understand that this implicates Victor directly. It could trigger a regulatory review. It could affect his personal—" "I understand. File it." He nodded and made a note. I drove back to the shop and sat in my office for 20 minutes before doing anything else. I wasn't angry at Victor. I was something colder than angry. I was finished being surprised. Everyone in that family had an angle. The difference between them and me was that mine was in writing, authorized, and entirely above the table. That night, I sat in Iris's doorway after she fell asleep and watched her breathe for a while. She was curled around a stuffed raccoon she'd had since she was 4, one foot hanging off the edge of the mattress, completely peaceful. I thought about Reed Ashburn, who didn't know about the pregnancy. I thought about Simone, who'd planned the entire choreography of that shower with a precision that still impressed me in a grim sort of way. I thought about Victor, who'd built an empire and handed the keys to the one person he trusted, and now was discovering what that actually meant. And then I stopped thinking about all of them and just watched my daughter sleep. Some problems you solve with documents. Some things you just have to protect.
The family court filing landed on a Monday. Simone's attorney, a man named Leonard Vance, who specialized in high-asset divorce and had the kind of quiet confidence that comes from winning enough cases to stop worrying about the ones he might lose, submitted an emergency motion. He claimed that my invocation of the trust clause constituted financial coercion, that it created an environment of emotional duress for a pregnant woman. He requested immediate restoration of Simone's access to trust distributions and a temporary freeze on any further asset reviews. Douglas had the response filed by Wednesday afternoon. I sat in his office while he walked me through it. The counterfiling was precise and methodical. It addressed every claim Vance had made, cited the specific charter language authorizing my actions, and attached as exhibits the video documentation of the baby shower incident, the compliance board's preliminary findings, and a certified copy of the trust governing documents, including the morality clause and its definition of reputational harm. "The emergency motion is a standard opening move," Douglas said,
leaning back in his chair. "He's trying to create urgency where there isn't any. The clause language is airtight. A family court judge isn't going to override a private trust's internal governance on the basis of emotional duress without substantial evidence of misconduct, and there is no misconduct here." The judge denied the motion within 48 hours, standard operating procedure, inadequate basis for emergency relief. Vance refiled as a standard petition. Douglas said we'd respond in the normal course and not to lose sleep over it. I wasn't losing sleep over the legal process. I was losing sleep over Simone's next move. It came on a Friday evening. I picked Iris up from school, and she was quiet in the back seat in a way that wasn't her usual quiet. Iris's silences are normally the kind that precede a question about raccoon biology or whether animals dream. This one was different. She was looking out the window, holding her backpack in her lap like she was cold. "Mom called the school today," she said about 2 minutes from home. I kept my eyes on the road. "What did she say?" "She told Mrs. Patterson that I should go home with Grandpa Victor after school on Fridays from now on." She paused. "Mrs. Patterson called you, right?" She had. Mrs. Patterson had called me at noon, and I'd already spoken to the school's administrative coordinator about authorized pickups. My name was the primary contact. Victor's was not. "I told Mrs. Patterson I wanted to go home with you," Iris said. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You did?" "Yeah." She shrugged with the particular casualness of a 7-year-old trying not to make a big deal out of something that was a big deal. "I didn't want to go to Grandpa's without knowing if you knew." I pulled into our street and stopped at a light. "Iris, you did exactly the right thing. And for the record, wherever you go after school, I will always know about it ahead of time. That's a guarantee." She nodded and seemed to settle. By the time we got home, she was asking about dinner. By the time dinner was over, she was reorganizing her raccoon habitat in the hallway. I called Douglas that night and told him what had happened. He added it to the case file. The second attempt came 2 weeks later. Simone sent a message through Iris's weekend art teacher, a volunteer named Teresa who ran Saturday classes at the community center and had no idea she was being used as a courier. Iris came home from class, relayed the message word for word with the matter-of-fact accuracy of a child who doesn't yet understand adult subtext, and then asked if she could have a popsicle. "Mom said to tell you she wants to talk. She said it's important and you should call her." She tried to use a 7-year-old to fight her legal battle. I didn't yell. I just added it to the record. I gave Iris the popsicle and called Douglas. Douglas filed a motion citing documented attempts to use a minor child as an intermediary in adult legal proceedings. He also filed for primary physical custody, citing documented parenting interference with established school protocols and Iris's expressed preference, which in California carried weight in family court proceedings once a child reached a certain level of demonstrated maturity. Meanwhile, on a separate track, the Compliance Board completed its preliminary review of Victor's unauthorized transfers. The board, chaired by Victor's own cousin, a conservative retired banker named Arthur Holbrook, who had no patience for what he privately called family accounting creativity, issued a formal finding of unauthorized distribution. The matter was referred to the trust's forensic accountant and, per reporting requirements, flagged to the relevant regulatory authority for review. Victor called me the night the finding was issued. It was almost 10 o'clock. He sounded older than he had 3 weeks ago. "Arthur Holbrook called me this afternoon," he said. 20 years we've been in the same Sunday golf group." "I know." "Was that necessary, Garrett, flagging it to the regulators?" "It was required," I said. "Charter Schedule 7. Douglas reported it because it's mandatory. I didn't have discretion, and neither did he." A long pause. "I built that trust from nothing. 40 years." "I know you did," I said, "which is why the rules you wrote should apply to everyone, including you."
The custody hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in a family court building in downtown Riverside that smelled like floor wax and recycled air. I arrived 20 minutes early with Douglas, 2 folders of documentation, and the particular stillness that comes from knowing you've done everything you could do before walking through a door. Leonard Vance was already there with Simone when we arrived. She looked composed in the way people look composed when they've worked at it. Hair neat, expression neutral, hands folded on the table. I sat across the room and didn't stare. Judge Patricia Weston ran a tight courtroom. She'd reviewed the filings in advance. That was clear from the way she moved through the proceedings without pausing to orient herself. She asked direct questions, accepted direct answers, and had the particular impatience of someone who'd been in family court long enough to recognize a manufactured argument from a genuine one. Vance opened by reiterating Simone's pregnancy and the emotional difficulty of the current circumstances. He argued that disrupting a child's relationship with her mother during this period would cause lasting harm. He was articulate and organized. It was a good argument for a weaker case. Douglas responded with the documented record, Iris's school counselor's written statement, the incident with the school pickup, the art teacher messenger attempt, the compliance board findings, the denial of both emergency motions, the paternity acknowledgement that Reed Ashburn had filed 2 weeks earlier. He presented everything in sequence, calmly, without theatrics. Judge Weston asked for Iris's counselor's statement to be read into the record. It was 3 paragraphs. The relevant part said, Iris has expressed on multiple occasions and without prompting a clear preference to remain in her father's care. She is emotionally stable, academically consistent, and demonstrates a secure attachment to her father that I would consider a primary protective factor during this transition period. Judge Weston asked one more question before ruling. Who is the named father of the unborn child on the current legal record? Vance answered that paternity was a separate matter pending resolution. Judge Weston noted the answer in the record, allowed it to stand, and moved on. She granted me primary physical custody of Iris. She established a structured visitation schedule for Simone, 2 weekends per month and 1 midweek evening, with all exchanges to occur at a neutral location and all communication between parents to be conducted through a designated co-parenting app. She noted the previous attempts to use Iris as an intermediary and stated plainly that any recurrence would be treated as a violation of the parenting order. Simone said nothing when the ruling was read. She kept her hands folded. Leonard Vance wrote something on his legal pad. I thanked Douglas in the parking lot. He said I'd done the work, and the outcome reflected it. We shook hands, and he drove away. I sat in my truck for a moment before starting the engine. Iris was at school. I was picking her up at 3:15, same as every Tuesday. She didn't know about the hearing. I was going to tell her simply, in the right words, that evening. The call came 12 days later. It was Victor. Not his usual measured tone, something thinner, more careful. He said Simone had been admitted to the hospital the previous night. She'd gone into early labor at 34 weeks. There had been complications. The baby had been delivered by emergency procedure. The baby was alive, small, in the NICU, but stable. Simone was recovering. I sat with that for a long time. Victor didn't ask me to do anything. He just told me. The way a man tells someone information he thinks they deserve to have, regardless of the circumstances. Thank you for calling, I said. She made her choices, he said. So did I, but she's still my daughter. I know, I said. We ended the call without pretense. I went and picked up Iris from school. On the way home, I told her carefully and simply that her mother had been in the hospital but was okay. She was quiet for a moment, then asked if the baby was okay too. I told her the baby was small but being looked after by good doctors. She nodded and looked out the window. After a minute, she said, "Dad, can we get a pet raccoon?" I laughed, actually laughed, the first real one in weeks, and told her we'd have to look into the legality of that. She said she'd do the research. I told her I didn't doubt it.
8 months after the hearing, I bought a house on Oleander Street in a quiet neighborhood in Murrieta. I checked the school district twice before making an offer. I liked that it was 15 miles from Riverside, off any route that mattered, the kind of street you had to be looking for to find. 3 bedrooms, a 2-car garage I immediately converted into a workshop annex, a backyard with room for Iris to do whatever Iris was going to do next. I paid cash, not from the trust. Not a cent of it had ever touched my personal accounts, and I'd kept it that way on principle. This came from my own business, which had grown steadily over the past year in the way businesses tend to grow when you stop spending your mental energy on things that can't be fixed and redirect it toward things that can. Iris chose her room on the first walkthrough. She stood in the doorway of the larger of the 2 secondary bedrooms, looked around for about 4 seconds, and said, "This one." She had a vision. I didn't ask questions. We spent a Saturday painting it, deep forest green, an unusual choice for a 7-year-old, but Iris had always had definite opinions. By the time we were done, the room smelled like paint and looked like a forest, and she stood in the middle of it with green specks on her forearms and said it was perfect. Victor settled with the compliance board in the spring. The terms weren't public, but Douglas told me they involved a significant repayment to the trust foundation accounts and a restructuring of his personal involvement. He retained his family patriarch status in name. The operational authority stayed with me. He called me the day after the settlement was formalized. "I owe you a conversation I should have had with Simone 10 years ago," he said. I told him it wasn't on him alone. He said, "Maybe not." We agreed to disagree about the proportions. Simone's visitation had settled into a workable rhythm. She showed up on her scheduled weekends, was present and appropriate with Iris, and communicated through the co-parenting app without drama. She was living in a smaller apartment in Pasadena, far enough that the distance felt chosen. Once, about 3 months after we moved, a message appeared in the app outside our usual schedule. Just 3 words. "Can we talk?" I didn't respond. 20 minutes later, she deleted it. Neither of us mentioned it again. Reed Ashburn had acknowledged paternity of the baby, a girl, I'd been told in passing. Whether he and Simone had any kind of arrangement beyond that, I genuinely didn't know and didn't seek to find out. That wasn't my story anymore. Mine was the kid who'd done the research on pet raccoons and presented me with a 3-page report explaining why they were illegal to keep in California, but could be observed ethically at wildlife rehabilitation centers. We'd visited one in San Diego the month before. She'd taken notes. On the drive home, she'd asked me if the raccoons ever tried to come back after they were released. I didn't know. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I think some of them probably remember where they used to live." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just kept driving. On a Sunday in December, about 8 months after the day everything broke open at that vineyard, I was in my workshop annex with the garage door up, rebuilding a commercial ice machine someone had dropped off for a complete overhaul. Iris was in the backyard, throwing a tennis ball against the fence with the rhythmic patience of a kid who could entertain herself for hours. The afternoon light was flat and warm. The neighborhood was quiet. She came to the garage doorway at some point, ball in hand, and watched me work for a minute. "Dad," she said, "is this what it's going to be like now?" I set down the wrench and looked at her. "More or less. What do you think?" She considered it with the seriousness the question deserved. Then she shrugged, bounced the ball once on the concrete floor, and said, "It's perfect." She went back to the yard. I picked up the wrench and went back to work. But later that evening, after dinner,
I noticed something. When a car pulled into our street, headlights sweeping across the living room window, Iris glanced at the front door, just for a second. Then she looked back at her book like nothing had happened. She did it again 20 minutes later when another car passed. I didn't ask what she was looking for. I wasn't sure I wanted to know.